Howard Snyder and the crew of the B-17 Susan Ruth. It's an Amazon #1 bestseller and recipient of more than 25 National Book Awards. It's set within the framework of World War II in Europe and recounts the dramatic experiences of each member of a 10-man B-17 bomber crew after their plane, piloted by the authors, Steve Snyder's father, was knocked out of the sky by German fighters over French and Belgium on February 8th of 1944. Some men died, some were captured and became prisoners of war, and some men evaded capture and were missing in action for months before making it back to England. Their individual stories and those of the courageous Belgian people who risked their lives to help them are all different and all remarkable. Even before the dramatic Battle of the Air and the subsequent harrowing events on the ground, the story is informative, insightful, and captivating. Prior to the fateful event, the book covers the crew's training, their journey to England, what life was like on the base, as well as in London and in the English countryside, and the perils of the 8th Air Force flying combat missions over occupied Europe and Germany. Through personal letters, oral and written accounts, declassified military documents, and interviews, all from people who took part in events that happened over 70 years ago, even the German Luftwaffe pilot who shot down the aircraft, the stories come alive, adding to the feeling of being there. There are more than 200 time period photographs interspersed throughout the book. He's here in Pennsylvania to be part of World War II weekend, buy a raffle ticket at Reading, and he's graciously offered to speak to us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Steve Snyder.
Thank you, Tank. I really appreciate that. I'm delighted to be here today. I always enjoy coming to Pennsylvania because my Snyder ancestors are settled in Pennsylvania after coming from Germany. In fact, my 5th great-grandfather, Simon Snyder, was the 3rd governor of Pennsylvania, and after which Snyder County is named. My presentation tonight is really in 3 parts. So the first part, I talk about my dad before the plane was shot down. Then I talk a little bit about the B-17 and what flying combat was like. And then I talk about what happened to my dad after the plane was shot down. And then following my presentation, I have a little short 13-minute documentary that's going to be shown as well. Growing up, I knew the basics of my dad's World War II history. I knew he was a B-17 pilot. He was stationed in England with the 8th Air Force. His plane was named the Susan Ruth after my oldest sister, who was 1 year old at the time that he went overseas. And he flew bombing missions over Europe, and on February 8th of 1944, his plane was shot down. And he was missing in action for 7 months, but he evaded capture and eventually made it back to England. But it wasn't until I retired, as Tank said, in 2009, that I had the time to really delve into my dad's war history in more detail. My parents had kept a lot of material about the war years, and I just wanted to go through that, organize it, and learn more details. And there were 2 items that were really significant. One was a diary that my dad wrote while he was missing in action about his plane being shot down, which is absolutely riveting. So much so that it was included in 2 books that were written. On the left is The Mighty Eighth by Gerald Astor. It was about the 8th Air Force, who flew its first mission on August 17th of 1942. And the goal was to hit military and industrial targets to cripple Nazi Germany's ability to wage a war. The 8th Air Force got its moniker, the Mighty Eighth, from noted historian Roger Freeman, because of the number of bombers they could put up on missions, which numbered into the hundreds. And on December 24th of 1944, 2,000 bombers hit targets around Berlin, which is hard to even imagine, to have 2,000 bombers in the sky at one time. The other book was First Over Germany. It was about the 306 bomb group that my dad was in. It was written by Russell Strong, who was a navigator in the 306, and became his historian after the war. The 306 had the motto, First Over Germany, because they were the first bomb group in the 8th Air Force to hit a target in Germany, Wilhelmshaven, on January 27th of 1943. The other item that was really significant were all the letters that my dad had written to my mother when he was stationed in England. And my dad was really candid in these letters. He talked about what bombing missions were like, what life was like on the air base, what life was like in London and England at the time, escapades of him and his crew. And sitting down and reading those letters was just fascinating, and I became fascinated with the story. And it became my passion. I started reading book after book about the air war over Europe, went on the internet, spent countless hours doing research, downloading declassified military documents. I went on a quest to find relatives of all my dad's crew to ask them what information they could give to me. Started going to reunions, and finally, 3 years into my research, I just came to the conclusion that the story of my dad and his crew was so unique and so compelling that it needed to be told. So I decided to write a book. From the time I started my research, the time the book was published was 4.5 years. I did something that was rather unique. I formed my own publishing company, Seabreeze Publishing LLC, which is the name of the street that I live on in Seal Beach, California. And then I contracted with independent professionals for all the associated services, such as editing, cover design, interior layout. The book, for the hardcover book, the printer is located in Michigan, and then I use a fulfillment house in Indiana who stores the books and distributes them. The first half of the book builds up to the day the plane was shot down, and then the second half of the book is all about what happened afterwards. And it's not just about my dad, but it goes into detail about what happened to each member of my dad's crew, and also about the courageous Belgian people that risked their lives to help them. But I wouldn't have been able to have written the book if it wasn't for two Belgian gentlemen. On the left, you see my dad in his bomber jacket with Dr. Paul Delahaye. That picture was taken in 1994 at the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Belgium and of my dad's plane being shot down. And on the right, you see me with Jacques Lelot. That picture was taken 20 years later for the 70th anniversary. These two men were young boys during the war, and they saw firsthand the atrocities committed by the Nazis against their family and friends. And later in life, they became local historians, and they interviewed Belgian people and members of the Belgium underground about events that took place involving my dad and his crew. They documented their testimony, and they gave me unbelievably detailed information about events that have been lost forever. So I owe these two men a huge debt. Initially, my dad didn't go into the Air Force, a result of the first peacetime draft in U.S. history, implemented by President Roosevelt in the fall of 1940. My dad went into the Army in April of 1942, and he was stationed at Fort Lewis, Washington. And at the time, the U.S. military was woefully weak when World War II started. They ranked 18th in military strength in the world behind Romania. And they were also very ill-equipped, as you can see by the World War I vintage uniform that my dad has on here. 3 months later, he married Ruth Hempel at First Lutheran Church in Pasadena. My mother was born and raised in Pasadena as I was. Shortly after she graduated from UCLA, where she was a classmate of the legendary Jackie Robinson. When I went to UCLA, I was a classmate of Lou Alcindor, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. My dad was born in Norfolk, Nebraska, and then he moved to California with his family prior to starting high school. A few months later, on December 7th, a date which will live in infamy, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor and the United States was at war. Well, my mother was very fearful. The future was very uncertain. So she decided to go up and see my dad in Washington over Christmas. And 9 months later, Susan Ruth was born. Well, my dad was worried how he was going to support his family. He has a new bride, a baby on the way, and he didn't think he could do that very well on a private's pay in the Army. So he decided to volunteer for the Air Force where he could make more money, especially if he could make it through pilot training and become an officer. So he went through pre-flight training at Santa Ana Army Air Base, which is only about 20 minutes from where I live in California. And then he went through the various stages of pilot training. This slide's a little busy, but on the left-hand side, you see the three main stages of pilot training. First, you have primary training. And then if you're able to make it through primary, you went into basic. And pilot training was really tough. 40% of the cadets that started pilot training washed out. And they either became bombardiers, navigators, or perhaps gunners. Then after basic, they went into advanced pilot training. And that's when they separated the pilots out. They either went into single-engine planes, fighters, or twin-engine planes, which resulted in bombers or transports. Typically, the shorter pilots went into fighters because of their cramped conditions in the cockpit. My dad was 6'3", so they put him in twin-engine planes. But personally, I think it was based on personality as well. It seems to me fighter pilots are kind of cocky, have a big ego, risk takers, independent, whereas those bomber pilots tended to be a little more level-headed and team players. Here you see my dad in primary training at Santa Maria, California. This was a big day for him because it was the first time he soloed. Back then, you couldn't wear your goggles on top of your helmet until you had soloed. And you see he's smoking a cigarette there. I think everyone back during the war smoked cigarettes. Here you see the three different planes that he flew in pilot training. Up top in primary, he flew a Stearman biplane, and then the middle picture in basic, he flew a Vultee-Valiant single-wing plane, and then advanced training down below a twin-engine Curtiss-Wright AT-9. He graduated from advanced pilot training at Douglas, Arizona in April of 1943, where he earned his commission as a second lieutenant in his pilot's wings. And then he went on to transitional crew training, where he learned how to operate a 4-engine B-17 bomber. And then from there, he went to operational crew training, where he learned where the various members of the team or the crew came together and they learned to operate as a team. And then once deemed ready, they were assigned overseas to the European Theater of Operations. My dad and his crew reported to the 306 Bomb Group at Thurley, England, which is about 60 miles north of London, on October 21st of 1943. That's what the base looked like back then. The base is no longer there, but the surrounding countryside looks just the same. It's all rural farmland. Here, there is a nice little museum there, though, that holds, it looks small, but it holds a tremendous amount of artifacts, memorabilia, and stories and information. I've been there several times. Here you see the insignia of the 306 Bomb Group. In the 8th Air Force, there were three air divisions. The 306 was in the 1st Air Division, which was signified by a triangle. And then every bomb group had a letter designation. For the 306, it was H, so the triangle H was a designation for the 306th. In addition to being the first bomb group to hit a target in Germany, the 306 was the longest serving bomb group in the 8th Air Force as well. They arrived in England in 1942, September, and they stayed on until January of 1946. They were involved in the Casey Jones project, which was the aerial photo mapping of Western Europe and Northern Africa. Many of you have seen the 1949 movie 12 O'Clock High starring Gregory Peck. That was based on a true story about the 306 Bomb Group. The fictitious bomb group in the movie, the 918th, was derived by multiplying the 306 by 3. Another distinction of the 306 is that their flight surgeon, Dr. Thurman Schuler, was responsible for convincing 8th Bomber Command General Ira Aker to implement a mission limit in April of 1943. Up until that time, there was no mission limit. And the morale of these combat crews was going into the tank because they realized they would never, ever make it home. They'd either be killed or be shot down and become prisoners of war. Dr. Schuler suggested a mission limit of 20. Aker set it at 25. But at least they had these combat crews had a light at the end of the tunnel and something they could shoot for and had some hope of making it back home. Every bomb group had 4 bomb squadrons. These are 4 bomb squadrons in the 306. In the upper left was the clay pigeons, so named by a journalist in England because they took more losses than any other bomb squadron in the 8th Air Force. And my dad was in the lower right Fightin' and Bitin' Squadron, and they had one of the best records of and least losses of any bomb squadron in the 8th Air Force. At one time, they had the record of 42 consecutive missions without losing a plane. And that was only broken after D-Day. By that time, the Luftwaffe had been wiped out. Here you see the ground crew. I always like to point out the ground crews. The combat crews got all the recognition and the glory, but these ground crews were the ones that kept these planes flying. After missions, they'd stay up all night, usually in very inclement weather, repairing battle damage, doing maintenance on the plane, replacing engines, replacing tires. And they took great pride in these planes, and they considered it their plane that they just loaned out to the combat crews occasionally to fly missions. So they were really the unsung heroes. Here you see my dad's crew. A B-17 had a 10-man crew. You see 4 officers that are kneeling in front. My dad's on the lower left, and as he was the first pilot, and as such, the commander of the plane and the crew. And then going across, you have the co-pilot, the navigator, and the bombardier. And then standing behind them are 6 enlisted men who were mainly gunners. 5 of these men made it back home, but 5 of them did not. That's not the Susan Ruth, that's just a B-17 that they took their picture in front of when they arrived at England. I would like to point out the nose art on the upper left. I love the nose art. It's interesting that the Air Force was the only entity that allowed their planes to be painted and named. The Navy didn't, the Marines didn't, nor did other countries. But the Air Force thought it could help the morale of these young guys if they could personalize their planes. And they were very creative in what they named and painted on their planes. You know, many times it was a cartoon character, but more often than not, it was a scantily clad or nude woman. You know, after all, these guys were in their late teens and early 20s and were very young men. The 306 bomb group flew B-17s. The 1st Air Division and the 3rd Air Division flew B-17s. The 2nd Air Division flew B-24 Liberators. And it was nicknamed the Flying Fortress because the heavy armament they had in the plane. They had 13 50 caliber machine guns that could put out a tremendous amount of firepower. And also the B-17s could take a tremendous amount of battle damage and keep flying. Every plane had markings on its tail to identify them. Again, you see the triangle H of the 306 bomb group in the 1st Air Division. And it also had a serial number on the tail that was assigned by the manufacturer. The Boeing company designed the B-17 and produced 60%, but Lockheed Vega and Douglas Aircraft each produced 20% as well. There were 3 different models of the B-17 flown in Europe. First was the E model, but they only built about 500 of those, so it was quickly phased out by the F model. And then it was replaced in the fall of 1943 by the definitive B-17 model, the G model, which you can always tell by the chin turret underneath the nose. Here you see the crew positions on the plane. Again, this is the G model with the chin turret. You have the bombardier in the nose, and behind him the navigator, then the pilots above them, the flight engineer, and the bomb bay, and the radio operator, the ball turret underneath the plane, 2 waist gunners, and then the tail gunner. The bombs hung up on racks in the bomb bay, and it was really cramped in there. This boy's only 8 years old. That catwalk's 8 inches wide, so you can see how tight it is. It was more cramped than a B-17 than a submarine. And occasionally on bomb runs, these bombs would get hung up on the racks, which would require one of the crewmen to either kick it loose with his foot or get a wrench and knock it loose. And when those bomb bay doors are open, he's looking 5 miles straight down to the ground, so that took a little courage to do that. Here you see the crew positions a little more clearly. This is the F model without the chin turret. The bombardier's first job was to drop the bombs accurately, but in the G model, when they were under attack, he manned the chin turret. Then you had the navigator who needed to know where they were and where they were going, and when under attack, he manned the cheek guns that were each side of the plane. Then above them, you have the 2 pilots, the first pilot in the left seat, co-pilot in the right seat. And you needed 2 pilots to fly these planes. These missions were 6 to 10 hours in length, so it was very tiring, both mentally and physically. They flew in tight formation, so they had to stay alert at all times, or else they could clip a wing on a plane next to them or run into a plane in front of them and go down. And also they had to continually fight the turbulence during flight. They had the natural weather turbulence, which we've all experienced in commercial flight. But they also had the turbulence of all those bombers being in such close proximity to one another. So the wake turbulence and the prop wash would just churn the air. It'd be like trying to control the plane in a washing machine. Then above them, you had the flight engineer. He manned the top turret when they were under attack. He was also called the crew chief, and he was kind of the onboard mechanic and knew how everything worked and helped monitor all the instruments in the cockpit. There were over 150 different gauges, dials, toggles, and switches. And the flight engineer would peer over the pilot's shoulders to help monitor engine performance and fuel consumption. And in the ball turret, behind the bomb bay, you had the radio operator. That was the most comfortable position on the plane. He had a relatively spacious compartment and a chair to sit at. And then the most cramped position on the plane was the ball turret gunner. And again, these missions were 6 to 10 hours in length, so being in that fetal position for hours on end was pretty uncomfortable. Then above the ball, you have the two waist gunners. That was the most exposed position on the plane. And then another cramped position in the tail gunner. My dad flew his first mission on November 3rd of 1943 to Wilhelmshaven, which was the first time the 8th Air Force had put up over 500 bombers on a mission. And flying combat was amazingly dangerous and really brutal. 26,000 men died in the 8th Air Force, which is more than the entire Marine Corps fighting in the Pacific. Another 28,000 men became prisoners of war after their planes were knocked out of the sky by enemy aircraft or an aircraft fire. Being a combat crewman in the 8th Air Force in World War II was the most dangerous duty in the United States military in World War II. And it was dangerous from the time they took out to the time they landed. There were about 40 bomb groups located in England, an area called East Anglia, which was about the size of Vermont. And on the day of these bases were only about 5 to 10 miles apart. So on the day of a mission, you could have hundreds of bombers taken off all at the same time. And back then, there wasn't any radar, there wasn't air traffic control, and usually the weather was socked in and you couldn't see anything until you got above the cloud layer. So mid-air collisions were not uncommon and airmen lost their lives. Then they had to form up. Individual planes formed up into 3-plane elements. Elements formed up into bomb squadrons formed up into bomb groups formed up into combat wings formed up into air divisions. And all this took an hour to 2 hours before they could even begin their journey across the English Channel. And then they had to fight the elements. These planes weren't pressurized, so above 10,000 feet they had to go on oxygen, or if not, in a couple of minutes they'd pass out and could die. And also it was extremely cold at the altitude they were flying. It was minus 40 to 60 degrees below zero. So frostbite was a huge problem. You know, one of my dad's waist gunners was in the hospital for 2.5 months because of the seriousness of his frostbite injuries. Here you see the combat gear that they wore. This is a waist gunner, has a steel helmet, tinted goggles, his oxygen mask, and he's wearing a flak jacket that was like an apron that had metal plates in the front and the back to help protect him, and his fleece-lined jacket, pants, thermal gloves, and boots. And you see the white kind of strap around his waist. That was a parachute harness. They didn't actually wear their parachutes in the plane because it was too cramped. So if they had to bail out, they had to have their wits about them to find the parachute to begin with and then clip it on hooks on the back of the harness and then bail out. The next thing they had to deal with was enemy fighters. Germany had radar stations set up along the continental coast of Europe, so they knew when these bomber formations were coming and they'd send up their Air Force, the Luftwaffe, to intercept them. Here again you see a waist gunner with his flak jacket on. You see all those spent cartridges on the floor of the plane, which is like stepping on ball bearings or marbles. And then you see manning his 50 caliber machine gun. The ammunition for the machine guns came in belts of 27 feet in length. So if a gunner fired the whole belt, they said he fired the whole 9 yards. And some people think that's where that expression came from. At the beginning of the war, it was 8th Bomber Command's belief that these heavily armed bombers flying in tight formations of 100 bombers could defend themselves from the Luftwaffe. And they flew in what was called a combat box formation. And this is the combat box of a wing. And then within the box of the wing, you see 3 boxes representing bomb groups. And then with each box of a bomb group, you see 3 boxes representing bomb squadrons. So the thought was that all this interlacing firepower could ward off the Luftwaffe. Here you see the formation, you know, from the front, from on the top and on the side. It was a 3-dimensional formation with a lead group, a high group, and a low group. But sadly, these bomber formations could not defend themselves from the Luftwaffe, and they took decimating losses in the early years of the war in 1942 and especially in 1943. Even though they implemented that 25 mission limit, it was statistically impossible to complete 25 missions. The average number of missions flown before being shot down in 1943 was only 6. And the losses culminated in the fall in October of 1943, when over a week's time, referred to as Black Week, 148 bombers were shot down almost 1,500 men. The worst day was October 14th, Black Thursday, when they sent 291 B-17s to bomb the ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt, and 60 of them were shot down. 600 men lost. 10 of the 15 B-17s of the 306 bomb group were lost that day. Well, the 8th Air Force was in shock. There was no way they could sustain those losses, and they discontinued flying into Germany for the remainder of the year. It wasn't until right at the end of 43 and the beginning of 49 when external fuel tanks were added to the P-47 Thunderbolts and the introduction of the P-51 Mustangs that they finally had escorts could take them all the way deep into Germany to the targets and escort them all the way back. The P-51 Mustangs were particularly effective. By the time D-Day rolled around, June 6th, they had wiped out or decimated the Luftwaffe, and by the time D-Day rolled around, the Allies had not only air superiority, but air supremacy. This particular P-51 that you see is owned by Tom Cruise. It was in the movie Top Gun Maverick. They keep it at the Planes of Fame Air Museum in California, about 40 minutes from where I live. The next thing they had to deal with is the anti-aircraft fire. This is a flak gun. Flak was the abbreviation for the German word for aircraft defense cannon. And these were deadly weapons. They fired 20 shells a minute, and they were calibrated for the shells to explode at the same altitude that these bombers were flying. And these shells were filled with all different shapes and sizes of razor-sharp metal called shrapnel that would burst out hundreds of feet and easily penetrate the skin of these bombers. It was so thin you could just take a screwdriver and just poke it right through it. From a distance, they looked like innocent black puffs, but when these formations got into that killing field, those puffs got louder. The explosions became deafening. If a shell exploded near the bomber, it would just violently rock the ship. If a bomber was hit directly, it would basically just disintegrate and disappear. If it knocked off a wing, that bomber would just plummet to the earth. My dad said even though it was so cold at that altitude, he'd be sweating profusely and his clothes would be dripping wet from the adrenaline running through his body. When they neared the target, they reached a pre-designated point called the initial point, or the IP, where they started their bomb run. And at that time, the first pilot gave control over the plane to the bombardier, who flew the plane through the Norden bomb site. It was tied into the autopilot of the plane. And it was a revolutionary device at the time. It was an analog computer that could calculate various factors, such as the speed of the plane, the altitude, the plane was flying, wind speed, wind direction, so they could accurately drop the bombs. And they were very secretive about it, too. The bombardiers had taken an oath to defend this with their life. But little did the U.S. know at the time that the Germans knew all about it. They had a spy, Hermann Lang, in the Norden bomb site factory and knew everything about it. Here you see the bombardier looking through the crosshairs of the bomb site. And when he released the bombs, he'd yell, "Bombs away!" And that would signal the first pilot to take control back of the plane. And he'd make a big turn to get the heck out of there and go to another pre-designated point called the rally point, where the bombers that made it through the bomb run tried to form up again and head back to their bases in England. Or once again, they'd have to face enemy fighters. And not only that, when they reached England, they had numerous dangers they had to deal with. The weather could be socked in. They couldn't even find their bases to land. Their bombers could be running out of fuel. There could be dead or injured pilots on the plane. The plane might have absorbed a lot of battle damage, engines out, flight controls out. And as a result, crash landings occurred frequently where more airmen lost their lives. It was on a bombing mission to Frankfurt on February 8th of 1944. My dad's plane dropped its bomb successfully, but the bomb bay doors got hit by flak and they couldn't get them back up. And a result that caused a drag on the plane. They lost airspeed and they fell behind the formation, heading back to their bases. And they were singled out by two German Focke-Wulf 190 fighters. And the ensuing air battle, the Susan Ruth, was shot down. But both those Focke-Wulf German fighters were shot down as well. One was piloted by Siegfried Merrick. His plane crashed and he was killed in the plane. The other was piloted by Hans Berger, who was able to bail out. One day when I was doing my research, my wife Kalinda said, "Well, why don't you try to find the German pilot that shot down your dad's plane?" And I'm thinking, oh, brother, she's so naive. She has no idea what she's talking about. It could be impossible. But like a good husband, I did what she told me to do, and I found Hans Berger. And fortunately for me, became a translator after the war, so he speaks perfect English. And I found out from Hans that the gunners on my dad's crew shot him down at the same time he shot my dad's crew down. They shot each other down. And Hans gave me some wonderful insight that's in the book about what it was like to go up against the mighty 8th Air Force. I mentioned that the book goes into detail about what happened to each member of the crew. I don't have time to go into each member of the crew tonight. You're going to have to buy a book to find that out. But after my dad bailed out, he came down in these trees right at the French-Belgian border. And his parachute got hung up on the branches, and he was dangling 20 feet off the ground, and he couldn't get down. But fortunately for him, a couple young Belgian men, Henri Franken and Raymond Dervan, came to his rescue before the Germans got there. This occurred early in the afternoon. They went back to the farmhouse, got a ladder and a rope, helped my dad down, and they told him to stay put and hide because they thought it was too dangerous to move him during daylight with German patrols combing the area looking for these guys that had bailed out. This is the tree that they helped him down. That's Henri Franken. He sent this picture to my dad after the war. And as Take mentioned, there's over 200 time period photographs in the book, so you can visualize everything you're reading about. Many that were taken by Belgian people, either sent to my dad after the war from his helpers, or that were provided to me, sent to me by Jacques Lelot or Paul Delahaye. So that night, they took him to the Devan farmhouse. That house is still there today. Those trees are in France. The house is in Belgium, so it's right at the border. And he only stayed there one night because, again, they thought it would be too dangerous for him to stay there any longer than that, again, with those German patrols in the area. So the next night, a Belgian customs officer, Paul Tilcan, came on a tandem bicycle to take him to a safer location. And they headed out in the middle of the night, pitch black. My dad said it was drizzling, kind of miserable. My dad had some shrapnel wounds in one leg, so he could only pedal with his good leg. And they came to a hill, and they couldn't pedal the bike any further, so they started pushing it up to the top of the hill. When they got to the top of the hill, there was this building there, a little cafe, cabaret. This is what it looked like in 1994. The light was on, music was playing, people were laughing, and all of a sudden, two German officers come walking out with two young French girls, and one of them comes up to my dad, puts his arm around him, and asks him for a light for a cigarette. Well, my dad's petrified. He can't speak German, and at that time, he couldn't speak French, but Paul, knew what they wanted and lit the guy's cigarette, and they let him go on their way. My dad said these German officers were too drunk, or as they used to say, schnockered, and too interested in these young girls to pay much attention to a couple guys pushing up a bike in the middle of the night. And from there, my dad was moved from place to place to place. How long he stayed at any given location depended on how brave the people were who lived there and how dangerous the Belgium underground thought it was for him to stay there. He might spend one night, he might spend 6 weeks. Here you see my dad with some of his Belgium helpers. He had many more than this. But this gives you an example. They stuck a beret on him to help him try to blend in with the locals, but he was 6'3", so quite a bit taller than any of the local Belgians. And the people who hid my dad, or any down thereman for that matter, were unbelievably brave people. They risked not only their lives, but the lives of family and friends, because if the German secret police found out about it, the Gestapo, they'd be arrested, tortured, and either sent to a concentration camp or shot. And some of the people who did help my dad and other members of my dad's crew did meet that fate. Here you see a couple women that my dad stayed with for lengthy periods of time. On the left is Gislaine Bayou. It was with her and her husband Maurice that my dad wrote his diary. And on the right is Jeanette Guedin. Her husband was a captain in the French army who was captured in 1940 when Germany first invaded the lowlands and was a POW for the remainder of the war. And it was very stressful for my dad in hiding. He was almost discovered several times, and those are described in the book. But to begin with, his plane was attacked. It's on fire. He's got to bail out. He comes down in a foreign country, has no idea where he is, doesn't know what happened to his buddies on the plane, can't communicate with the U.S. military. He's being helped by total strangers who can't even communicate with one another. My dad had a little French-English dictionary in his escape kit. And any of these people could be a collaborator and turn them over to the Germans. We'll talk about one time that he was almost discovered. This was at the Bayou House in Charleroi. At nighttime, there was a loud pounding on the door, and Maurice told my dad to get up on the roof, and then he'd come back and get him once the Germans left the area. Well, they never left the area. My dad spent the whole night up on the roof. And I've been in this house, and you can't see it from this angle, the photo, but there's a little tiny window in the attic that you have to squeeze through to try to get up on the tile roof, which is really a steep pitch. I can't even imagine doing that, but he was up there all night. Finally, word came that the Allies landed in Normandy on June 6th, and my dad decided to get back into the fight. Unlike most airmen, he had that year's experience in training in the infantry, so he knew how to fight on the ground. And he wanted to join the French resistance. His helpers tried to talk him out of it because it'd be too dangerous. You could die fighting, being killed, or if the Germans captured him, he would have been shot on the spot as a terrorist. But he felt there were other Americans fighting and losing their lives for their country and fighting for freedom, and he thought it was his duty to get back in the fight. The safest thing for him to do, and the most logical thing, would just be to stay put, hunker down, and wait till the U.S. armies came up through France and liberated the area. And I don't know how many people would have made the decision that he did, because that took a lot of courage and a lot of bravery. But he talked one of his helpers into escorting him on bicycles down across the border into France, and he hooked up with a unit of the French resistance called the Maquis. This is not the group my dad joined, but it gives you an idea of what they look like. The Maquis were small, independent, ragtag guerrilla groups located all across France, and their job was to harass the Germans. They would disrupt communications, sabotage railroad lines, assassinate German officers, attack convoys, and they got their directions from the British over the BBC through coded messages. And my dad said the information they gave him was unbelievably accurate. If they said a German convoy was coming down this road on this date at this time, sure enough, they'd be there. And that was a result of the British cracking the German Enigma code and knowing everything that the Germans were up to. This is the farmhouse in France that they stayed at. Here you see my dad in front of it. That picture was taken in 1994. And he stayed in that tower where you see those two windows. On one occasion, it was early morning, he just had his skivvies on, shaving cream, and he looked out the windows and saw a German patrol coming up the road. So he jumped out these grain windows in the second story and then hightailed it into the woods and tried to escape so he wouldn't be caught. Who took this picture and how it ever got back to my dad, I'll never know, but this is my dad fighting with the French resistance 80 years ago. And there's a number of encounters that are in the book of the Maquis group attacking convoys, which are pretty thrilling. Right there in front, jumping out of the Jeep in the white light clothes. Finally, word came that there were U.S. troops in Trélone, France. It was September 2nd of 44. 7 months after he bailed out, we went into the town square, went up to an army major. It was an element of Patton's Third Army, which had come up through France after D-Day. He identified himself. They interrogated him to make sure he was who he said he was. And then he caught a ride on a convoy taking German prisoners to Paris, and then hopped on a transport and got back to England, where he sent a Western Union telegram to my mother saying, "Back at base, fit as a fiddle, bank the money, honey," because he had all that back pay coming. Belgium is a wonderful little country. A lot of people don't realize it's divided in two. The upper portion is called Flanders, where they speak a dialect of Dutch, Flemish, and it's rather industrial and more heavily populated. And then the lower half is Wallonia, where they speak French, and it's all rural farmland. I don't think my pointer's going to work here, but oh yeah, right here is where really all the action took place, where the plane came down. Actually, my dad and the plane came down in Belgium, and the other guys that were able to bail out came down in France, and they were brought back across the border into Belgium, either by Germans who captured them or the French resistance. And then my dad was heading in Charleroi for a while, and then that French farmhouse where the Mackey group stayed in Trélon, France, where he was liberated, right around here. The Belgian people are wonderful people. To this day, they are so thankful and so grateful for the Americans and the Allies coming to their rescue and liberating them from 4 years of Nazi occupation and Nazi oppression. And they do a great job of educating the younger generations as well. In 1984, Dr. Delahaye formed the Belgium American Foundation to remember and honor events that took place, and they've erected a number of memorials in the area where they have celebrations. But the big celebrations always surround September 2nd, when this area of Belgium was liberated. And they're wonderful events. This is a poster from the 70th anniversary. They last several days, and they erect these big tents. That is just a portion of one that seats hundreds of people. And they have band concerts and dances and dinners and lunches, and everyone has a fun time. The local volunteers dressed in period outfits, and the local beer Chimay just flows, and everyone has a grand time. But they have solemn occasions as well when they have ceremonies at various memorials in the area. This is the memorial at Cendron, which is right at the French-Belgian border, where the U.S. 9th Infantry first crossed over from France over the Wartoise River into Belgium to liberate the country. All the villagers come out, all the dignitaries, local dignitaries make speeches. The U.S. military is there. The 424th Air Base at Chevres comes down. The Belgian military are there, the French military. The U.S. ambassador to Belgium comes down with an entourage. They're just wonderful, very moving and emotional events. And again, you can see here those young people up in front to signify and make so they realize the importance of these events. Like most World War II veterans, my dad didn't talk a lot about the war until they erected a memorial to my dad's crew in 1989 in Mackenoise, Belgium, was right near where the plane came down. And my dad and 3 other members of his crew that were still living at the time went over for the dedication. And there my dad was reunited with all these Belgian people that hid him and revisited these places where he was hiding. And it brought it all back, and he started talking about it. Here you see my dad at the day of the dedication. The man with the beard is Dr. Delahaye, my dad in his red, white, and blue tie. And then next to him is Jeanette Godin, who I showed you in that earlier picture. And then next to her is Nellie Tilcan. She was the wife of that Belgian customs officer, Paul Tilcan. A couple months after he helped my dad, he was arrested by the Gestapo, tortured, sent to prison, and narrowly escaped being executed. But because of the torture he took and the beatings he took, he died at a young age of only about in his early 50s. And then the man in a trench coat, that's the other man that held my dad down from the trees, Raymond Dervan. I've been to Belgium 6 times. I made my first trip to Belgium in 1994 with my father and my parents. And that's when it became personal for me, because I went around and saw these places firsthand. You see, I'm on the left, my dad, my mother, Ruth, and then that's my other sister, Nancy, in the picture. She was born when my dad was missing in action. So that was really tough on my mom, because here she's back home. She has a 1-year-old Susan Ruth and an infant baby, Nancy, never knowing if she'd ever see her husband again. On 2 of the occasions, I've traveled on to Munich, Germany, to visit that German Luftwaffe pilot, Hans Berger, who shot down my dad's plane, and we became friends. He said it was unfortunate that they had to be shooting at each other, but it was war, and he would always say we weren't all evil Nazis. He was pretty much just like the U.S. airman. He was 19, 20 years old, trying to do a job, fighting for his country and trying to stay alive. Here we are in his apartment. He has his fighter's jacket on, and you can't really see his Iron Cross there, but he shot down 7 B-17s and 1 Spitfire. He was shot down 3 times himself. The only reason I think he even made it through the war is that at the beginning of 1945, they pulled him out of combat to become a test pilot for the H.E. Henkel 162 single-engine jet fighter that they were trying to perfect, which they never did. But I think that saved his life. And then here you see Hans and me. We had to go to the Hofbrauhaus to have a cold one. This is my dad and me at the World War II memorial in 2004. I accompanied him to a reunion of the Air Force's Escape and Evasion Society, actually in the King of Prussia here, and then we took a bus down to the memorial. It was before it was officially dedicated. He wanted to see the memorial before he died. That was the last trip he ever took. He died 3 years later in 2007. He wasn't the last crew member to die, but he was the oldest at 91. And today, all the World War II veterans are in their late 90s or over 100. At the end of the war, there were 16 million veterans, and as you can see from this graph, it's a little old, but that's been declining rapidly, and now there's only about 100,000 of these men still with us. There was no other event in history that affected more people than World War II. 60 million people died, millions more were wounded, millions more were left homeless and displaced. It changed the course of America and the world forever. And the brave young men who fought and died for freedom are without doubt the greatest generation. And their sacrifice must never be forgotten. It's our duty to remember. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We're going to show a little 13-minute documentary, and then after that, I'll be glad to take questions from the audience if you have any.
Like most World War II veterans, my dad didn't talk a lot about the war. Growing up, I knew the basics. I knew he was a B-17 pilot. His plane was named the Susan Ruth. He flew bombing missions over occupied Europe. And on February 8th of 1944, his plane was shot down. I had a wonderful relationship with my father. He was a tough guy, kind of a no-nonsense guy. We compared him to John Wayne. He was that type of character. My parents grew up in an area with tough times. They went through the Depression, and they were tough people as a result of that. World War II came along, and there was no other event in history that affected more people. When Japan bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, the country rallied. They believed in their cause, and they were willing to sacrifice all to achieve victory. Flying combat was incredibly dangerous. The average number of missions flown before being shot down was 6. For these guys to keep going up, on mission after mission, knowing that the next one could be their last, took a lot of bravery and a lot of guts.
I got shot down on my 8th mission. I was up in the air, and 2 phone poles came in, and they shot the heck out of us. They came in about 1 o'clock. They just made one pass. Everything blew up. 2 of my men were killed in the plane. 2 evaded capture. I was one of them, and my tail gunner was the other. And then 3 of them got down safely, but they were picked up by the Germans, and they were interrogated, and then they were marched out into the woods and shot in the back of the head. 3 Belgian farmers saw the chute open, and they came running over, and they threw me a rope, pulled me up to the tree, and got me out of the tree. And one of them took me off into the woods and hid me. They were different personalities, of course. Some of them were brave, some of them were scared to death. The ones that were scared of hiding you by, they move you pretty quick. The ones that weren't scared, you might stay there 6 weeks.
They risked not only their lives, but the lives of their family and friends. If the German secret police, the Gestapo, found out about it, they'd be arrested, tortured, and either sent to a concentration camp or shot. And some of the people that helped my dad and his other members of the crew met that fate. Word came that the Allies had landed at Normandy on June 6th, so he knew they'd be coming up through France to liberate that area. His Belgian helpers accompanied him over the Belgian border into France and joined up with a unit of the French resistance called the Maquis. They would disrupt communications, sabotage railroad lines, attack convoys, assassinate German officers. And so he fought with them for a couple months.
The very first hours of the 2nd of September 1944, few jeeps of the Reconnaissance Party of the 60th Infantry Regiment crossed the border, and there the Belgian population were waiting for the liberators. They were waiting there for 4 long years, and they saw the liberators coming in, and they were waving, they had flowers. It was very happy days for all people of Belgium.
Word came that there were U.S. troops in a nearby village of Trélone, France. So he walked into the village, into the town square, up to an army major. My dad identified himself, and that ended his 7 months of missing in action. The Belgian people saw firsthand the atrocities committed by the Nazis. To this day, they are so grateful and so thankful still for the Americans coming to their rescue and liberating them from Nazi oppression.
My father, Paul Delahaye, started the Belgian-American Foundation in 1984. It was for the 40th anniversary of the liberation of Belgium. The GIs who had been killed deserved the right to be honored and to receive homage from us because they gave their life for us.
Every year they have ceremonies at these various memorials that they've erected in the area on the anniversary date of those events. But the big celebrations are always on September 2nd, the anniversary date of the liberation of Belgium.
Your father came the first time in 1988. I remember him when he came the first time because we were very young, so that was the Americans. We had never seen Americans, you know, so that was a bit crazy.
In 1994, I took my first trip to Belgium with my parents. There was an event. There were hundreds of people in this hall, and we were a little late arriving. My dad walked in, and the entire place stood up and started applauding, and it was really moving. You know, they treated him like he was the President of the United States. I'll never forget it. I got a whole new appreciation for my dad, because, you know, I knew these stories, but, you know, you hear the stories, but, you know, they're not that personal to you. But when you're there and you've seen these places where the events took place, I've been in rooms where my dad was hidden. Think that he was right here. He climbed out this window to get up on this roof. You know, the history is preserved right there. The locals really saved my dad's life.
It's a war we fought together. He came here to liberate my country. Why wouldn't I help him?
I corresponded with him from the time I got back to the States until they died. They're wonderful people. They're brave people. I mean, they risk their life to keep you from being captured.
My parents had kept a lot of material from the war. There were 2 items that were really significant. One was a diary that my dad wrote while he was missing in action. And the other item were all the letters that my dad wrote to my mother during the war that she had kept. And sitting down one time, spending several hours reading these letters, and I just became fascinated with the story of my dad and his crew, and it became my passion. I just came to the conclusion that the story of my dad and his crew was so unique and so compelling that it needed to be told. People needed to hear about it, and so I decided to write a book. Shot Down focuses on one crew and what happened to each member of that crew. That it just makes for a fascinating story, one that hasn't been told. All that the U.S. military knew was that my dad's plane was shot down by 2 Focke-Wulf German fighters, and I just assumed that's all I'd ever know. One day, during my research, my wife Glenda said, "Why don't you try to find the German pilot that shot him down?" But like a good husband, I did what she told me to do, and I found Hans Berger. He's 95 years old now. He lives in Munich, Germany.
Here's a picture of Hans. Well, that's pretty neat. There's your plane, your picture, and your autograph.
The young people of today, they have no idea what our life was, what the time was, what difficulties we had, and that we were not all evil Nazis, but we were people like you and me, And we just grew up in different spheres. On this 8th day of February, your father and me met, and we shot each other down.
I've been asked several times, like, well, don't you hate this guy that shot down your dad's plane? But no.
Well, good for you. It keeps.
From the very get-go, I felt a personal relationship with Hans. He was 20 years old. He was fighting for his country, just trying to do a job and trying to stay alive. And World War II was the defining moment in my father's life. Really, I think it's the defining moment for any guy's life who fought in World War II.
Yeah.
And Hans is a part of my dad's life, a part of his story. And so I had no ill feelings toward Hans, and we become friends.
Never thought that I'd meet the son of a guy I shot down.
Yeah, well, I never thought I'd meet you either.
I know the facts, but more want to know the why or how he felt, because I never asked him about it until it was too late.
Miss him?
Yes, I do. He was a great man. It's too bad that I didn't do all this while he was still living.
We had a deep respect for the American troops who came and helped us. We know that if they didn't, the world wouldn't be the same today. I'm trying to do now the same with my kids. So I'd like them to learn about that, and first to learn respect towards the Americans who came and did it and sacrificed for us.
I do think that we own them liberty. It's the less we can do. It's try to make sure they will never be forgotten.
As World War II fades in the memory, people lose sight of what took place, what that generation fought for. Because, you know, the old expression, if you don't learn from history, you're going to repeat it. They say that for a reason. So it gives you appreciation for your freedom and maybe a better appreciation for the people that served, and gives a better appreciation and value for your country. So that's really one of the reasons why I do what I do, is to try to keep the memory alive.
So if anyone has any questions, I'd be glad to answer them. One thing I didn't mention, I hope to, I'm going back to Belgium this fall for the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Belgium, and I had hoped to visit Hans one last time, but sadly Hans passed away this last January 20th at age 100, so I won't be able to see him again.
Cliff, you got me? Yeah, there you go.
Thank you. That was really moving. I was just wondering if your sister, Susan Ruth, is she still with us?
Yes, Nancy's no longer with us, but Susan, she's 5 years older than me. She lives in Scottsdale, Arizona.
And can I ask how she feels about having a historic airplane named after her?
I don't know. Sorry. Well, actually, there are more down there in the story that are involved. and who were killed. And half of them were brought back to the States, and half of them are still buried in Europe. One is buried at Ardennes American Cemetery in Belgium, and 4 of the men in the shot down story are buried in Margraten at the Netherlands American Cemetery.
I noticed the one photograph of the grounds crew, and I was trying to count the number, and I got into like 28 or 29, but I don't think I counted them all. How many were in a typical ground crew to support the 10 people in the plane?
Yeah, in that picture, there's a few more people than were in the actual ground crew, but I think it was about 13, if I remember correctly.
I wanted to say thank you for your presentation. I really appreciated the photographs of what it looked like inside the plane. Like, I heard of these positions before, but I had no comprehension of exactly what the men went through, and so I thank you for that. I also just wanted to share that I had a run-in with a Belgium veteran at the Harrisburg airport 10 years ago. And he walked up to me and thanked me profusely for the America's help in Belgium. He brought me to tears. I mean, I'm not a vet. I contributed nothing to that, but he thanked me as an American. And I just wanted to share that with the group after what you said. Thank you.
Yeah, I went back, the second time I went to Belgium was in 2004 at the 60th anniversary. My parents weren't well enough to travel. But it was completely embarrassing because they treated me like I was some, World War II vet, and it was very unnerving, because here I was just the son of the pilot, and they're treating me like I was a hero. It was very, I didn't like it.
Yeah, first of all, I want, like other people said, thank you so much for speaking to our group tonight. We really appreciate it. It was a really great presentation. You mentioned during your talk how thin the outer shell of the B-17 was, but of course and as you stated, it's legendary for it to be able to survive so much battle damage. So I'm wondering what was it about the plane that made it very durable? And I also was wondering if you might want to comment on, comparing the B-17 and its service record to the B-24 Liberator.
Well, the infrastructure of the B-17 was really strong, even though the thin aluminum skin on it was just, I forget how much thicker it is than aluminum foil. But the infrastructure was really solid, and I've gone to a lot of these 8th Air Force reunions, and the B-17 guys and the B-24 guys, would get in these arguments. And it's true that the B-24 could fly faster. It could carry a larger payload, but it could not take the battle damage at all that the B-17 could. Also, it could not fly as high as the B-17. And if you ditched in the Channel or the North Sea in a B-24, it broke apart and the wings are on top of the plane, so it just sank immediately. Where the B-17, its wings, were on the side, it would float and allow these guys to get out. And any pilot that I've talked to that flew a B-17 and a B-24 said the B-17 was superior. I'm prejudiced, of course, but.
Question over here. I have a similar Belgian story. When I was a junior military officer in the Army in the late 1970s, I was over in Europe for 2 weeks for a NATO conference. And I'm in a Gasthaus in Germany. And, in a Gasthaus, you sit next to whoever's there. And I'm sitting next to this lieutenant colonel in the Belgian Army. And we start talking, and I told him that my dad was a ground crew chief on B-17s during World War II. And his eyes teared up. and he grabbed my hand and he said, when you go home, you tell your dad I said thank you. He said, I remember as a young man the B-17s flying over, and they actually bombed my village, but we were not upset by that because we knew that what they were doing was going to bring freedom to us. And I said, my dad didn't fly, he was just a ground crew chief. He was a ground crew chief. And he said, it doesn't matter, he was part of what freed us from the Germans. So yeah, that's my memory of the thanks that the Belgian people had.
Yes, that's what they're like. It's amazing.
So I've been to a couple of museums with having the B-17s, and there was one that had plexiglass for the side gunners. Now, I know that came late in the war. Did your dad's plane have the plexiglass covers to keep some of the weather, et cetera, out?
Yes, the G model that came along in the fall of '43 had plexiglass windows at the waist guns. Also, in the F model, they were open. You can imagine what the wind like was pouring in that. Also, in the F model, the two gunners were right across from each other, and they would bump into each other, so they offset them in the G model. My dad had just got a new G model. He flew the G model the last two missions. Up until that point, he flew the F models, but he went down in a G model.
Thanks for your presentation. Were you able to discover any information on the wreckage of your father's plane? And also, throughout his saga, was he able to hang on to any of his flight gear or any sort of memorabilia from the flight?
When the plane went down, the Germans surrounded it because they needed scrap metal, and they recycled it, and so no one was able to get really close to the plane. They did get some local Belgian people some parachutes that they made dresses out of, baby clothes, a wedding gown, handkerchiefs. They did get some plexiglass. In fact, they made little crosses that they sent to my mother and my grandmother, which my wife and sister have now. But other than that, no. Although on one trip to Belgium, a Belgian friend of mine said he knew a guy that was a collector, and he had pieces of my dad's plane. This guy couldn't speak English, the other guy, his friend. So I went over to his house, and he has this museum with all this stuff, and he gave me two pieces, and I was ecstatic. But then when I brought him, I brought a small piece back home. The other piece was like this big. I couldn't get that on the plane. So I donated it to the little museum that's there in Belgium. But then I found out afterwards it wasn't a B-17, it was a Halifax. So I was pretty disappointed about that. But as far as memorabilia, my dad brought back a handgun, a Spanish Llama, a 9mm pistol that he used when he was fighting with the resistance. This is his graduation ring from advanced pilot training. He does have, he had some Nazi emblems, and he got off uniforms that he dedicated to the museum. He dedicated his Eisenhower jacket to the museum in Belgium. I do have a German tank sergeant belt, though, a Nazi tank sergeant belt that they took off a tank sergeant when they were attacked a convoy. So I do have some nice memorabilia.
With the amount of B-17s we were losing in 1942, how did they ever keep up with production?
Well, at the early years in '42, they had a real tough time, supplying enough planes. And that was a big problem that General Aker had, that, they didn't have enough planes, so they were more vulnerable because the formations weren't that big. And so it wasn't until '43 that they finally started getting the production up to get enough planes over there. They had enough pilots, but at the beginning of the war, they didn't have enough bombers to send over there. But gradually, they were able to build up, and then once the production got rolling, then they were just coming off the assembly line. That's the thing that overwhelmed both the Japanese and the Germans, is our production capability. Although the Germans really kept up with production, their problem was they didn't have enough fuel to fly the planes, and all their experienced pilots pretty much were killed, and these younger pilots didn't have any training time because they couldn't waste fuel on training flights. So these German pilots, toward the end of the war, they would go up with just a handful of hours. They'd be going up against these U.S. fighter pilots that had hundreds and hundreds of hours. And so it was a total mismatch.
My dad was a supply sergeant with the 8th Air Force, and I wonder if you would happen to know if a supply sergeant was assigned to a plane, or were they just general supply for the whole squadron? Or
I don't know for sure, but my guess would be that they would have to be assigned to a squadron.
Yeah.
So they'd handle that whole squadron.
So my dad would never talk about the war, and my sisters and I always wondered, you were just a supply sergeant. You didn't see combat or anything, so why were you reluctant to talk about it? But then over the years, I've come to understand that they would know these crew members. They would see a plane go over the horizon and crash and into a big fireball, and they'd see the planes come back with people all shot up and the plane missing wings and stuff. And so I understood finally.
Yeah, because a lot of those bombers were not a lot, but a significant number, crashed on takeoff and lost the whole 10-man crew. Or these planes coming back, injured or killed, and they called it sweating out the mission. All the guys back at the base, they would wait for these bombers to come back. You've probably seen this in movies where they'd send 20 planes out, and they would count them to see if there's 20, and then there's only 13, and they did know those guys and had friends, so it did affect them without a doubt.
Yeah, I was wondering how many people or how many of the crew bailed out with a parachute, or did they all crash land?
No one was in. Excuse me. No one was in the plane when it crashed. 2 were killed in the plane, and the other 8 bailed out. And something different happened to each one of those 8 guys.
So we've been advertising Masters of the Air. I know a lot of people haven't seen it because it was on Apple TV, and it was difficult to watch for some people. But what was your impression of the show? I imagine you've seen it?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
I should have asked you that ahead of time.
I watched everyone as they aired. The greatest thing I think they did was to show what it was like to fly combat missions, the terror and the chaos in the plane when they were flying those missions between the flak exploding and the enemy fighters. Some other things, unlike Band of Brothers, they didn't have that good of character development. One thing that I didn't really like is that they switched back and forth between this venue and that venue, so it's kind of hard to keep track. And also in the plane, they have their oxygen masks on, so you really can't tell one guy from another. And then they're talking in their intercom, which is kind of garbled, so you didn't get a personal connection like with the Band of Brothers, because you just followed them and got to know them so well. And then they did certain things, like they put in the Tuskegee Airmen that did not fly with the 8th Air Force. They were with the 15th Air Force in Italy. But the thing that kind of threw me off to begin with was Austin Butler, because I don't know if many people have seen the movie Elvis, but he played Elvis in the movie, and he talked just like Elvis Presley in this World War II movie. Then I was going, wait a minute. But it was very good. And then, well, they really didn't touch on what shot down is about, and that's all what happened about these guys that were shot down and missing in action for months and months, and interacted with the resistance in the underground.
Did many of these guys? We got red mic and blue mic. There you go. Knowing that these guys flew together, they became family members. Did the surviving ones, did they also, after the years, go to the families of the ones that died And did they let them know, or did they, spend Christmas time with these families?
The ones who were killed, I don't know that. I know the 5 of the crew member that survived, my dad, they got together occasionally, socially. And his bombardier lived in Pasadena, not too far from my parents, so they saw each other semi-often. I even met him when I was younger, but when you're a kid, you go, Steve, come in and say hello to Mr. Daniels and Mr. Musial and their wives. So you go, okay. And you go, okay, can I go back to my room now? You just don't appreciate this stuff until you get older. But I've become friends with relatives of all the crew, those that have survived and those who were killed. And so that's very special. And at the 70th anniversary of the liberation and the 75th, we had about 25 different people, a group of about 25 relatives go over for those and participate, which was really nice.
Steve, when you were back in Belgium for some of the memorial services, did you get to the Henry Chappelle Cemetery?
Yes.
That's
Yes.
where my father's buried.
Oh, yeah, the cemeteries I've been to, Henry Chappelle, the Ardennes, Colville, D-Day in Normandy, the Netherlands American Cemetery, and then also the Cambridge Cemetery in England.
I can second your feeling. The Belgians are very grateful still.
Yeah, yeah, and you just get such a humble feeling when you visit those cemeteries and just row and row and row of grave markers.
Yes, like everyone, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And this is a little more of a, talking about tactics. You've been to the reunions of the bomber. If I'm not mistaken, the British Air Force was really night. They were pretty much primarily bombing at night, where the Americans were, that was a decision, I believe, that was made where Americans would do the daylight bombing, or they felt because of accuracy. Did you ever get any sense of any of that kind of controversy, not really a controversy, but decision on that strategy of daylight bombing versus night?
Well, it was definitely a controversy. The British tried daylight bombing, but they took too many losses. They go, but there's no way we can bomb during the day. So they started bombing at night. And the British did area bombing or carpet bombing, and they decided to bomb cities because they thought if they kill civilians, that the civilian population would put pressure on the Nazis to end the war, but that didn't happen. And then when the Americans came and started daylight bombing, the British thought we were crazy doing that. And Churchill was pushing, no, you got to bomb at night, you got to bomb at night. But then in January of 43 at the Casablanca conference that had the British and the Americans, Ira Aker convinced Churchill that, well, if you bomb at night and we bomb during the day, it'll be around-the-clock bombing, and the Nazis will not get any rest at all. So Churchill liked that idea. So he goes, okay, then you guys can bomb during the day. But, the Norden bomb site was this revolutionary bomb site, and before the war started, they say, oh, they could drop, a bomb in a pickle barrel. But it wasn't near that accurate. When they were training in the United States, they're in Texas, they're in Arizona, nice climate, no clouds whatsoever. They're at 15,000 feet, and they were really accurate in training in the United States. But then when they got over there, and the weather was horrible, clouds, you could hardly see anything, and then you're at 25,000 feet, and you got flak exploding all over the place, and enemy fighters, the accuracy went way, way, way down. So though the U.S. wanted to do precision daylight bombing, there was still lots of collateral damage.
Mr. Snyder, thanks for coming to talk to us tonight. So I kind of have a story where my wife and I, we were in our early 20s, and I saw my grandfather, and she kind of prompted all this, and it led to an interesting conversation. We went down to South Florida to hang out with him one summer, and it was just a random afternoon, and she's like, let's play Twister. I'm like, my grandfather's not going to play Twister. You know, like, I don't know what you're trying to do here. So sure enough, he did. He played, like, he took like the little color code thing and spun it around, and her and I would do the little contortions and stuff. But it was kind of funny. We just start talking, and all of a sudden he starts talking about his first wife. And they're like, wait, what? You know, he's like, yeah, when I was first married after I got out of basic. I'm like, well, hold on, what are you talking about? Like, you talking about grandma? He's like, no. My grandfather had a war bride. Who knew, you know? So it was like one of those things where you just kind of hear like a record scratch in the middle of, like, you know, it's like, you know, and it's like timeout. So I talked to my dad and his brother and sister, and they're like, yeah, you know, we had no idea either. So it was just this random thing. So yeah, my wife, I can kind of relate to you about having your wife kind of prod you along and find out something new. But I appreciate, you know, the sentimentality you showed in the video there at the end. I know for me, I miss my grandfather immensely. Like, I remember he'd call me when I was on deployment. He came to see me, got in a van, drove 12 hours to come see me graduate from basic and AIT and all that. Brought the dogs, everybody. You know, it was great to see him. You know, when he'd call me when I was on deployment, are you eating good? Yes, sir. Are you warm? Yes, sir. Trust me, I'm plenty warm. You know, all sorts of things like that. And, you know, and so when he passed, you know, I felt it personally. And so when I was in my late 30s, my dad and his brother and sister, my aunt and uncle, gave me a box of medals and a couple photographs of him. And they're like, hey, you know, this is for you. And it's like, you get all these different pieces of his life. Like, you're looking at 20 some odd years of a military career here. And there's like a Distinguished Service Cross, which is still a mystery because I don't have any record of him getting that. It's the second highest Medal of Valor, but it is very worn, so I don't know how he got that. But I'm finding, researching him, and now I'm working on my great-grandfather who fought with the AEF in the First World War. They're still here with me, you know, and that's great. And I just, you know, I really felt your sentiment there when you in your video. It's like, for me, it keeps them all alive. I'm still there. It's still back in the 80s. We're still laughing and having a good time, or having a snowball fight with my grandfather when I was a little boy, and, you know, that kind of thing. So thank you for your effort, and thanks for speaking to us tonight.
Thank you. That's nice. Very nice.
Sorry, my wife prodded me again. Just curious, what happened with your father after, we couldn't quite put the pieces together. What happened after he fought with the French resistance and when he went back to England? Was he recycled and sent back on missions again, or was it after 45 and the war was over?
Good question. They sent him back home to be a B-17 flight instructor. They had a rule that if you were shot down and aided by the underground, you could not go back into combat, because they thought if you were shot down a second time, captured by the Germans and tortured, you'd give up the identity of the people that helped you the first time you were shot down. The only exception to that was Chuck Yeager, who personally met with General Eisenhower and got back into combat.
One last question.
My dad was in, you said about the B-17. My dad was at Mountain Home, Idaho, and one of his jobs was, he was the guy, I think B-24 or B-26, I'm not sure which. They would fly around the B-17s, and they'd put a target out the back on a cable and let the gunners shoot at the target.
Yeah.
And he had some stories.
Okay, we're going to do the raffle before we do our gift and final announcements. Might need a hand here. You mind taking one number out first? All right. It is 26911056. Winner. One winner. You need to validate that. And our second ticket goes to 039. I have 039? I better check my pocket. It's not me. Somebody have 039? Bill has it? All right. Congratulations, Bill. Well done. All right. He's working there, so he doesn't need it. He's just donating. And by the way, Steve's going to be at the air show all 3 days, so you can get his book outside tonight signed or for the next 3 days. Ticket 012. 012. Last 3 digits, 012. It's not me. I'm in the 20s, I think. Yeah. 1 2? 1 2. All right. Never know. Or you got to stay here for a second. I'll hand it off to Chris to say thank you and give you a parting gift. I'll take that from you. Thanks for everybody for contributing in the raffle. Obviously, those funds are going to good use for our program. We appreciate it.
Congratulations to all the raffle winners. I just have a few moments to keep your attention for at the end here. I'm going to give a gift to the speaker. I have a couple closing remarks. I'll try to be somewhat brief. Steve, thanks so much for your presentation. I have our famous World Cup, sorry, not World Cup, I'm a soccer fan though, World War II Roundtable coffee mug. And it's our new one actually. Our book guy who's also our board member, Robin, said, let's give him the two-sided one, the new one we have. So we gave him the brand new one. And our old ones had just on one side with the logo. So you get the new one with both sides. And thank you so much for your presentation and your video and your PowerPoint. Nice to meet you tonight for the first time. And I don't know if you guys knew this, but Steve came all the way in from California, so he had quite a journey to make tonight, or today. Actually, he arrived yesterday, but he's here now. So thank you, Steve. You really added a lot to our history about the B-17s and your father and his squadron and the history of the 8th Air Force. Thank you. Thank you so much. And like Jeff said, Steve will be at the air show. I know a lot of you are going to go to it. I plan to go to it, probably a lot of you as well. I know definitely some of you are, because you told me, some of you. But anyway, you'll have a chance to say hi to Steve at the hangar at the air show if you go there this weekend as well. Just a few more words. Our next speaker, thank you. Steve's going to go. He's going to go in the back to sign some books then. Yeah. Steve will be at the back to sign some books. Just a few more words. Next month, July 11th, as Jeff said, Dr. Eugene Richardson, Tuskegee Airman. I don't know if he's ever had a Tuskegee Airman, not that I can recall, hearing about or being there for, so I think it's a new thing for us, and that'll be remarkable. We also have August 1st, World War II veteran, U.S. Army 740th Tank Battalion, only fighting at 16 because he went in underage in the Army, 16 years old. Can you imagine fighting the 1st SS Panzer Division, SS Adolf Hitler Division at 16 years old and coming out alive through that? He'll be there on August 1st for us, and thanks to all the veterans once again. Thanks to our founder and president, first president, Bill Jackson. Thank you, sir. And thank you for your loyalty for always coming to our meetings as well. We want to also, thanks to all our board members, thank you, and our volunteers. Our helmet committee guys are in the back with the blue shirts on and the helmets. And if you want to be so kind as to give us a donation tonight, we'd appreciate that. Not required, but we would appreciate it if you can, if you want to help us out with our expenses. And so I want to wish you a good night, and if you go to the air show, maybe I'll see you over there. Otherwise, I'll see you next month. Thank you, guys. Have a good night. Thank you.